Hello and welcome to day 47 of Crankworx Whistler. Behind me we have the SRAM pits because today they're going to give us a teardown of the new Rockshox Boxxer. The Rockshox or something like that, I can never quite remember. This fork has been prototyped since seemingly prehistoric times, but it's finally out in the wild and we're going to take a look at the fork and its internals today. So here we are in the SRAM truck. We've got one of the brand new Boxxer Ultimates in front of us and we're here with John and he's going to strip it down, take it apart, and then we've got some technical input coming from Tim, who's one of the engineers designing this fork. So before we get into any of that, this fork was prototyped for a long time. We saw that. How long was the prototype? When did the athletes first receive this fork?
So the first basically ride test with any of our athletes was after the Snowshoe World Cup in 2001. So basically they had done the doubleheader at Snowshoe. They'd raced that track for a week. We showed up with new forks right after the race. We rented out the bike park, rented out the lift, brought prototypes of this fork, and started testing like the Monday after the race was over.
So 2021. So
2021.
Yeah, nice. And in terms of the fork itself, does it share any architecture or any anything? You know, we got the Zeb, we got the Lyric.
Yep.
It tends to go feels with Rockshox. There's the Charger 1, the Charger 2, and now we're on the Charger 3.
Yep.
Is this a Charger 3 damper in this fork?
This is a Charger 3 damper, essentially the same thing that's in a Zeb, Pike, or Lyric, just longer, right? Mm-hmm. Just being able to fit within the 38 mil chassis and then be able to get 200 mils of travel.
And why do you think, with this fork particularly, I guess that's a coil sprung IFB, mm-hmm. Why did it, we had that bladder system mm-hmm. for a while, why did it take so long to get to a coil sprung IFB when now it seems that that's the way a lot of brands are going?
I think we had to learn what we were looking for. Charger 2 was actually a really good platform for us. We got a lot of performance out of it. One of the things that we had was based on being able to have remote actuation of it. We also had the flight attendant version of Charger 2. So when we looked at Charger 3, and actually Tim was the engineer behind it, we were kind of like, okay, clean sheet of paper, let's start over, right? Let's not be constrained by the things we've done in the past. So, we've done dampers like this all the way back in the Pure days, like in the early 2000s. So it was kind of coming back to what makes the most sense for a wide range of applications, right? We're talking about Pike could be all the way down to 120 up to this thing, which is 200 mils of travel. So trying to get the most performance out of this damper.
Well, should we actually get ripping apart this fork then?
Yep.
And as we're going to go through it, we're just going to try and understand the who, the what, the why, and also, how damping is achieved, because it seems like we're in kind of this golden age. Everyone seems to be making really, really good forks right now. Mm-hmm. And now the Boxxer's out there and it's another one to the party. So, should we start with taking it apart?
Absolutely. Let's do it. Okay.
So, first question, and this is just regarding the Buttercup system that now is kind of across your forks. Mm-hmm. When we've got these complex negative air chambers, which are happy to help the fork get into its stroke right from the off, we've got these sensitive coil sprung IFPs. How much difference really does an elastomer at the base of the fork make? And is that something you can see in any data? Is that something you can see in telemetry or anything like that?
It makes a huge difference, honestly. Like, we did a ton of blind testing early on in the project to make sure that we weren't fooling ourselves. So this was an idea really early on in the MY23, like as we're talking about Pike, Lyric, and Zeb. Actually, again, Tim's idea to come up with this kind of just floating elastomer to just kind of like take the vibration. So where a lot of people get hung up is that it really is vibration that we're talking about. It's like all that little junk that you're running over on the trail, this can move easier and faster than the air spring or the damper can.
Yes.
Right, so this thing's just floating in here and absorbing all those vibrations before they start the fork moving. So for us, we had the same thought as you. Like, really, does that make a difference when we're talking about ultra low friction, good air springs, good dampers? But yes, you can actually do the testing by riding a Select Plus version without buttercups versus an Ultimate. And we did all that back and forth on our local trails, and everyone unanimously was like, the buttercup makes a difference.
And something I've spotted, another thing straight from the off, is these holes here. Mm-hmm. Would that be oil being cycling through the lower
yep.
and into the damper? Or not necessarily into the damper, but an overflow option, or is it just a cycling through the lower?
Like if you look at it this way, right? So we're kind of attached in this orientation, right? Like if you can see the holes are basically, we're attaching down here, and we're using these to move oil up to this upper bushing. Right, one of the benefits of this new Boxxer design is we simply, and we'll get there later, we have 2 cartridges, right? So we have a damper cartridge, and we basically have an air spring cartridge now. So we don't need to be sealing on the inside of the upper tube like we would in the past. So it allowed us the flexibility to add these holes and basically circulate oil through these 2 holes back up to the upper part of the lower leg and keep everything lubricated.
And again, in some ways, obviously lubrication is a really, really important thing for low friction. But some brands don't actually put oil in their lowers at all. Does the oil in the lowers have a damping effect, or is it purely there just to keep friction to a low?
100% it has a damping effect as well. Yeah, that's one of the things, again, that we found kind of in the development of model year 23, is that all of the systems work together, right? So we have an air spring, we have a damper, we have a chassis, but also the lubrication system is part of the grand, like if you add them all up, it's the sum of the damping of the fork. And the lubrication keeps the fork sliding, but it also adds a damping quality to the fork.
And so if we were to go for like a really harsh bottom out, where we use the full length of the travel, was one of the reasons that maybe we went to this coil sprung IFP to move away from the vulnerabilities, I suppose, with a bladder, they're more sensitive to ingesting oil under that compression. Would I be right in thinking that with the coil sprung Charger 3, does it purge oil out through the top as well? Yep,
and we can, as we get in deeper, you can see essentially we're able to, it's kind of a self-regulating system in that it can ingest oil when it needs to, and basically when it gets too high, it'll purge that oil back out, it'll kind of go back into the oil bath system, and we kind of like keep working it through as it needs to.
Nice, lovely. Well, which leg would you like to get into first?
Well, we can take the damper out.
Yeah.
And then the air spring, we'll get that out next.
And sorry to keep asking a million questions. What's that marker for there?
Okay, so this guy, great question. So this is for bleeding.
Yeah.
So essentially, as you are setting the IFP height, we have to, we're cycling the damper. You basically would set the seal head to that line, and that's how you know your oil height. So no measuring required.
Oh, cool.
We're able to use that mark to be able to set the IFP height. So all the dampers have that. There are different lengths depending on the travel of the damper. But that line is the line you use to be able to set that.
Nice.
Yeah, just makes it for service, just makes everything a little easier. There it goes. It's right there. Okay, let me grab this. Oh, thank God. So the damper inside is very similar, almost identical to what we have in the shorter travel single crown forks. Just longer, obviously, for the 200 mil travel that we need for the Boxxer. We did make a slight change. One of the things, if people are familiar with the way a Charger 3 looks, we did update this seal head just for basically this seal here is the most critical seal. This is what's keeping oil in. And just basically to aid our factory in installing that and make sure it's always captured inside the seal head. But other than that, other than it being super long and 38 millimeters, it's not that much different than what we have in Pike and Lyric.
And with this being a sealed cartridge and the air side being a sealed cartridge, would that mean that apart from the markings for saying debonair, are those legs architecturally the same?
They are the same.
Cool, so if you smash one up?
Yeah, if you had to switch legs, you totally could. In the past, we would have had a dimple inside the air side upper tube. We don't have a dimple anymore. It's just a similar upper tube.
Great stuff. So should we get into the damper itself? Or do you want to compare? Let's take out...
we can take the air spring out, get them both on the table. I can move the upper tubes away, and then I'll probably hand it off to Tim, and he can show us how all that goes.
Sure.
So that's essentially, there's your air side, and there's your damper side.
And so, with this air system, a lot of brands now, well, more brands it feels like are going to some kind of three chamber system, and this is still sticking with the tokens. What does like SRAM Rockshox perceive are the benefits of a token system compared to, say, the adjustability of a 3-chamber system?
So I think the big thing, and it's kind of like I would say more of a company-wide philosophy, is we'd like to keep the adjustments as simple and easy to understand as possible. If people remember back in our history, we've had dual air, we've had 2-chamber air springs for a really long time. And what we found is 9 times out of 10, people didn't know how to adjust them.
And also I think with the 3 ramp up chamber, it does have, I think it's got like quite a high threshold in terms of all that performance, but getting there sometimes it can be really, how it affects the ride height can be quite counterintuitive.
Yep.
People then go higher in the ramp up and then it drops their ride height, or they go higher in their main chamber and then they go through, you know what I mean? The relationship between the two isn't that easy to understand always.
100%. And so, for us, the token system is really easy to understand, right? I would say the Boxxer air spring in itself is kind of I would say it's maybe an example of the best air spring we've made to this point, but the philosophy is the same. We want people to feel the pressure. We have an easy recommendation to get you started. If you feel like you're bottoming out, add a token. But it's not, spend a bunch of time, play with 3 air chambers. Like, we really want people to be able to get to a sweet spot as quickly as possible. So,
and a couple of years ago, I think when that first generation Pike, which kind of proved to be quite an important fork, that 2013, 2014 sort of era.
Absolutely.
There were a lot of people putting in large amounts of volume spaces. Now it feels that actually people are coming around to maybe a more linear setup.
Yes.
Do you think that's because, in fact, we are realizing that actually we don't want something that just has a huge amount of ramp up, or do you think that's because maybe the damping on the damper actually does more in terms of the heavy lifting and supporting and suspending the rider?
I think you're 100% spot on there. Really, I think, and if we rewind even 5 years ago to our own stuff, I think we were in a place where if you added a lot of damping, you might have gotten not the ride that you were looking for. Maybe too much feedback in your hands, maybe we're not tracking the ground as well. So the easy way to get support out of the fork was to add tokens, so we add ramp at the end. I think now, especially with Charter 3, you can have a ton of support from the damper, so you can run a more linear air spring. You don't have to have a ton of tokens, and you can use the damper for that support, that ramp up that you're looking for. Actually, a kind of a fun anecdote about this Boxxer, right? So we've obviously been testing this for a while. Most of our athletes have been on Boxxer for a really long time. They're all using 4 to 5 tokens in their 35 mil Boxxer. And going on to this model, we really had to kind of talk them off the ledge a little bit. It's like, hey guys, we made this spring. You don't need to cram it full of tokens. It works better if you don't, 1 token maximum, 2 maybe for the really big guys. And we've gotten all of our athletes to swing that way, really enjoy the more linear spring. One of the things we can talk about is the jounce bumper we added for bottom out support, but really being able to control it with spring rate. Like, if you feel like the fork's too soft, add air. Don't add tokens. Bring your spring rate up a little bit.
And, on rear shocks and bikes, it feels like there's a real settled precedent about how much sag we want to run. What's the recommended sag on this downhill Boxxer at 200 mil travel?
It depends. The racers, not so much. They're probably in the 20%, maybe less range, depending on, I think we usually start in the back and we're really looking for balance, right? 25% sag is kind of the general norm for a downhill race bike. And then we kind of try to match the fork to have a similar feel when they're on the bike in kind of the riding position. But it's definitely, you can't just pick 30% sag or 25% sag and hope for the best now. I think you kind of really need to look at that bike balance.
But do you think that maybe now that we're getting things in the shock, for instance, we've got position sensitive damping and bottom out, do you think there is, I feel my relationship with forks over the last, and geometry, is that now you can actually run a softer setup than perhaps you could previously. Do you think though that, how to put this, both riders are waking up to running more sag, and also damping is getting better across the board, across many brands, to be able to do that? Do you think that we could ever see a point where we even go to more than 25? Do you think that that's a possibility?
It would be great. Tim and I actually went to a test session with some of our athletes in Italy earlier this spring. and spend a bunch of time like circling around the sag number, like where can we get to? And I think it is a little bit of like mindset shift that needs to happen. Like the athletes kind of need to understand the benefit. They're also kind of hesitant to change sometimes, and I think that's where a lot of it starts.
Do you know who I blame?
Who?
Aaron Gwynn, providing amazingly hard forks and going so fast, and everyone being like, well, that's how you do it.
Sure.
Myself included, I was like, oh, sweet, I'm just going to go to 1 billion PSI and just weep at the bottom of every run.
And 6 tokens, and yeah.
But the way he used to ride a bike, and I think in that era, a lot of people had super hard setups, right?
Yep.
And now it feels like it's changing a bit.
Yep. And I think everything has to come together, right? We need to have the equipment that'll allow them to do that. Like I feel like we have a good place now where we have good air springs, good chassis, damping that works, that you can add damping without adding harshness or feedback in your hands. And that's like the steps in the direction to be able to do that. Otherwise, you just got a fork full of tokens and pressure that you're just barely hanging on to get down the hill.
Yeah. So which would you like to go into first? Would you like to go into
maybe the air spring first?
Yeah,
that's probably the easier of the two to take apart.
Again, so just to very quickly, it's sort of commonplace, especially on coil shocks, to see a big rubber bottom out. And is that essentially what that piece would there be? Yeah,
so we call this the jounce bumper, but essentially just to be able to give a greater cushion at bottom out, right? We do have bottom out pads that live within the lower leg. One of the direct feedbacks, like this is an interesting project in that during Boxxer, we spent a lot of time with our athletes, like lots of times at World Cups, a lot of time at test sessions and really listening to their feedback because, I think all of us can ride a trail fork, but when we start talking about downhill race forks and like current generations of downhill race forks, we really need to use the people that use them as their tools, as their everyday job. So listening to them, this jounce bumper was really critical to kind of soften that bottom out and really give some progressivity at the end of the stroke. So that was a big add and one that was really welcomed by the rider. So yeah, and actually if you look in some of our forks, we have a similar system, although it's maybe a third of that size in the SID.
And what stroke, how much can that compress down to, if you see what I mean?
That's a good question. I think that thing will go flat. Pretty close?
No, I bet it takes up 7 millimeters at the end there.
Okay, yeah.
So, but still, it can get hugely reduced in terms of stroke.
But a big hit will drive it all the way to you can get full travel on this fork.
Yeah.
If you make a mistake or really go hard.
It does kick in late though. It's not like coming into stroke or coming into play earlier in the travel.
Yeah. So would that be? I guess that'd be from 170 mil travel, ish. Upwards, it looks about like that.
Yeah, probably so.
Yeah. Cool. So let's get into this. So this is now a cartridge system where, like we said earlier on, an integral part to the air chamber previously, and with a lot of forks, is the actual leg of the fork.
The upper tube.
And it's just use both sides of it. Why would a brand, or what's the thinking behind going to a cartridge system?
This is where I'm gonna probably hand us off to Tim, and he can explain. The one thing I would say, he can get into the details of why we are here today. But I would say we started, the intention with this fork was think of the Zeb spring today. That's what the first prototypes that the athletes rode was essentially a Zeb spring inside of the upper tube, right? So our standard thinking, and really we couldn't get the curve, the air spring shape that we wanted with that, right? So we've got a big size upper tube, large diameter, lots of volume, lots of travel. And basically, as we worked through iterations of this, we started coming down to, we need to try something different, and that's kind of how we ended up here.
So before we were speaking with John, who's one of the product managers, and now Tim's come in as the head engineer to talk about sort of some of the technical aspects and the design reasons.
Sure.
So what would be the reason to go to a cartridge system like this as opposed to using the tube of the fork?
Sure, yeah. So a traditional spring might operate on the ID of a tube, and we've gone to 38 millimeters, which drives the piston, the main piston diameter out. That's fine. You could run lower pressure. Trouble is the compression ratio drives it to where you end up having a ramp at the end of your stroke. And so we end up being forced into playing games with volumes. Having a large tube drives you into a corner, especially at this longer travel, right? We took the Zeb spring and we scaled it to a Boxxer and found the corner we got trapped in and moved towards this. And it does a couple other things for us, which are slightly more complex. But the first one is, if you have a cartridge, all of a sudden your casting ramp, which is operating on the outside of this system, can expand all the way into here. And it turns out casting ramp is almost like someone you didn't want at the party. You know, that it's uninvited, but we all have to work with it.
So can you explain what casting ramp is?
Sure. So any kind of fork is going to have a sealed system here, and then this upper tube is operating in here. And in a traditional fork without a cartridge, that upper tube would be sealed at the foot of it. So when you go to full travel, that sealed tube is moving all the way down to here, and you've compressed this much volume into this much space. And that's part of a spring system, and it happens on both legs depending on your damping system. So that's something we're going to need to address. One of the ways you can address that is by allowing air to travel outside of this tube, inside of this tube. And that expands that volume at your most compressed state and allows us to get control of the curve.
And do these, I know we spoke about it earlier on, but these ports here,
they contribute to
do
that
they contribute to that as well? Because I actually noticed looking at this fork now, it's one of the first Rockshox Boxxers I've seen without the bulges at the side there.
That's unrelated. That's more into our bushing design.
Okay.
But what we do have is a space in between the upper bushing and the lower bushing, and that's a volume on the outside of this tube, but between these two, and that's another air chamber. And we want to access that chamber without any kind of delay or any kind of influence from the bushings and whatnot. So having these holes helps us access. Air can get in that chamber, no problem. It drags some oil with it as it's transferring in there. And then additionally, these small holes dip down into the oil bath and just drag oil up with them like a dumbwaiter.
Yes.
Lubing the whole system. You can't stress enough how important lubrication is in a fork. It's as much of a damper as the damper in some ways.
Yes.
So.
And before we get, I know we want to get into this air cartridge, but sometimes you hear at World Cups about racers resizing bushings.
Sure.
Is that something that the SRAM athletes have that maybe the ordinary kind of end consumer wouldn't? Or is that something that doesn't really happen so much?
It's our goal to get these bushings dialed to where no one has to mess with it. Early in the development, we struggled through some kind of development growing pains. I think you'll be pleasantly pleased that like the forks that you guys will get to ride later in this conversation, they're out of the box. There's no need to size those bushings.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sweet. So should we get into the air damper itself? Now, you were saying earlier on that this kind of comes in multiple contingent parts.
Yeah.
So should we strip it down?
Sure. It's not too complex, but we can clamp here, strap wrench here, and loosen this joint. And that'll just show you what you might imagine, just a piston flying around in here. So this counts as negative spring.
Yeah.
This hole allows air into this 14 millimeter shaft, which is new to us.
Is that to increase volume of the negative then?
In the negative?
Yes.
And it really gets us as much negative as we needed to shoot and hit our targets. You can also notice we have like similar to the Zeb piston here, we have a Teflon backup ring supporting this quad ring. And
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just to, a couple of years ago when you had that, was it the dual air system before solo air kind of really became established as?
Yeah.
Now that you could adjust the pressure independently, the negative and the positive chamber.
Yeah.
Is it a case of then not necessarily having a higher pressure in the negative, but rather a larger volume? Is that what?
No, so when you're doing that, you're literally saying how much pressure you want in this negative volume and how much pressure you want in your positive volume. So what that would do is the piston is going to come to a force balance point, and that will be your pneumatic top out spot. And so if you put more air into your negative spring, you could drive it to suck into its travel.
Yes. And it would break into the stroke
very
easy.
softly.
But what I mean is, so we've seen this new, in the last couple of years, lots of brands are going towards larger negative air chambers.
Yeah.
Is that because, what I'm saying is it maybe more important in terms of fork feel, not to give the option to just pump up the negative air and charge it, but actually
increase the volume.
Try and get the volume more equal.
So it's an interesting deal. You can really increase your negative volume. You know, the question is, well, why don't you guys just build a big negative volume every time it gets
every time
better?
you get bigger and bigger,
Trouble is you pay for it on the progression. Essentially, if you maxed out your negative volume, you will have a fork that gets complaints of not being able to get full travel by the end user. So we have to get clever on how we address that. That's sort of back to the original statement of why we took casting ramp out of the equation by putting a cartridge in there and letting the casting ramp part of this air spring be less impactful to the final design. That allows us to really go after our negative spring design and keep everyone in the right spot for progression.
And in terms of not being able to reach end stroke potentially, if you did have a really, really negative air chamber, is that because we compress the positive and we extend the negative? Is it like a vacuum effect essentially?
No. So if you make a giant negative spring, this is good. I usually use a whiteboard to explain this, but you have this big old negative volume, right? And as you compress, it's at a certain pressure, and as you compress, the pressure in this chamber is decreasing. And then as you extend, it's increasing, right? So what you need is you want force equilibrium right when the thing comes to top out.
Yeah.
So if this has a certain amount of force because it had a volume and a pressure, and it's come up to a pressure times the surface area, now you have a force going that way. That needs to be perfectly balanced with the area times pressure of the positive spring. So if you make a very healthy and impactful negative spring, you're essentially having to build a very healthy and impactful positive spring so that they come back to zero. And then as you go this way into travel, your positive spring starts running out of room because you really made it very high pressure in order to balance this guy. It's a little more complex than that, but if that kind of gives you an idea of the trade-offs.
Yes. No, totally. I often think it's a bit like having like a seesaw.
Yeah.
And if you only had one person on the end, they'd go to full travel every time. So you'd think, well, let's put a bit of weight on the other end.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
Because once you actually have the rider's mass in there, it gets complicated, but it's actually, it's about having something that doesn't go full stroke or just out, if that makes any sense.
Well, the interesting thing you could do is think of if you had no negative spring at all, you would have a positive pressure times the area of this diameter.
Yeah.
So super rough math, let's say you had 100 psi acting on 2 square inches. Now you have a 200-pound force pushing this thing towards top out.
Yeah.
And we didn't build a negative spring, so it's just pushing.
Yes.
And that's what you'd feel if you didn't swap. If you built this thing from scratch and you didn't fill the negative chamber at all, it's very firm. That's the force that you're trying to counteract with your negative spring. So we go down into travel, it swaps positive pressure into the negative volume, fills it. That dimple, or that swap point, is essentially doing what a dual air system would do. Puts the right amount of air into the negative chamber, and then it's up to the volume so that they come back and completely offset that 200-pound initial force of the positive spring.
So if I wanted to play devil's avocado, I would say, hey, there's a thing called a steel spring, which doesn't need all these complicated parts, and they go pretty well on rear shocks.
Yeah.
Why aren't we trying to perfect the steel spring or its application within forks instead of doing some very clever design but complicated architecture?
That's a great question. It's a little more complex than you would think.
Is it not just a case of like, I've got a biro with you can click it, same thing, right? It's just a steel spring in a tube, very reliable.
The simple answer is people don't want the lack of progression. Like a steel spring, if you look at the chart that it makes. It'll just be equal amount of movement creates an equal amount of increase in force. It's just a straight line. It's really hard to make it ramp enough at the end. Yeah, you could build a secondary system that kind of has air tunable ramp or something to kind of offset the lack of progressivity. But it ends up, again, being pretty complex for the end user to understand which part they're changing. And then the lack of availability of a steel spring, the end user will just deal with what spring they have, and it will be wrong for them. So this gives us a ton of adjustability and ability to adjust the progression, which is important and value added to the end user.
That's the air spring. Should we take a closer look at the damper? So we've basically kind of cleared the clutter a bit, actually drained this damper to take the oil out, so it's going to be a bit neater to disassemble on the countertop here. So is this basically just a upscaled Charger 2 damper that we'd see in the current generation, like model year 23 ZEBs?
Yeah, there are very few differences. You got 95% of what's in a ZEB that you could buy today at the store. So let's jump in if you guys don't mind.
Absolutely.
Like we mentioned, this has already been emptied, but we'll get a little bit of a mess going. So a seal head and a rebound piston, we call this, or mid valve it's often called. Normal buttercups, a small line as was mentioned to set IFP height on the final reassembly process. Interesting thing about these seal heads is not only are they designed to to manage the amount of oil that gets ingested from the lower leg here, but also we've managed the way they respond to pressure inside the damper. We don't want a buildup of pressure as the damper's designed to cause this seal to bind on the shaft. So we've done quite a bit of work with the vendor to create that.
And from a design point of view, is it kind of liberating to just accept that it's going to ingest oil and you've got a way to get it out?
Yes.
Compared to it being like, man, if this ingests oil, we're kind of fucked.
Yes. Yeah. Bladder dampers have a limitation in that exact area you pointed out. So, yes.
Yeah, it helps. Cool.
The other thing is, IFPs solve a few problems for us, and we're glad to have it on this product.
So for those of you who don't know, IFP is basically the internal floating piston. But as a damper goes through its stroke, it will displace some oil, and that's to compensate for that. So it could be done via a bladder, which might expand, or a secondary sort of
piston that has a spring behind it of some sort and moves out of the way.
And so you can get air springs or coil springs. Is there are kind of two schools of thought branding the brand? I guess Rockshox feel that you can have one universal spring irrespective of rider weight, or like it doesn't affect the damping because it's just a displacement chamber. But you see some brands that when it's an air spring in there, they actually do change the air pressure in the shocks at least.
Yeah, really, when you're making decisions on what IFP spring you should be using, it could be a coil spring or an air spring, as you've mentioned. What you're trying to do when you make that decision is guarantee that the oil inside this chamber never goes into a vacuum in any of kind of their respective spots. So you've got a zone here you would like to know about, a zone here you would like to know about, and a zone here that you would like to know about. And as you go through a maximum shaft speed event, which we've really done a decent amount of homework to really understand what the maximum shaft speed is. And then we actually custom ordered a dyno from a vendor to meet those specs, and that thing has unlocked our potential essentially. We've got a lot of good information and knowledge built around real fast shaft speeds. So it's under those situations that we've got dampers back at the lab that have pressure sensors all over it, and we study it, make up a decision for what that IFP spring should be, and it keeps the oil where it should be.
So in terms of the inputs into that dyno, is that based off real world riding conditions?
Yeah.
Are you out there with telemetry recording what it is?
That was actually the most useful. You see a lot of push towards telemetry, and it's a little difficult if anyone has used it themselves to really say what it is you gained from that experience. one of the...
Well, for me, it was telling me I was wrong about everything.
Okay.
That's what I learned. I was just like, well, that's a bit humble pie. Good to know.
Sweet. For us, that was actually one of the most directly useful studies that we've done. Is we had a top rider outfitted with really nice gear, came back, studied the data. It turns out in that particular kind of studying mode, you can apply filters. You have to apply filters to get the noise out, and you can really change the answer based on what filter you apply. So we've got some real smart guys back at the office, and they studied that really well.
And so, in terms of riders being different weights, running different spring rates, is there a shaft speed that we're trying to settle on, like a bandwidth? Like it should be between this and this, and that's irrespective of rider weight?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think,
because I feel like, sorry, just a secondary question, but I feel that with high speed damping, oftentimes we're trying to tune the outliers as much as anything. I know it can set the tone for all the damping throughout the fork, but when little bits of limit testing that I've done, that's when it's been like, oh my god, my shaft speed was really high and
yeah. I always talk about high speed damping. It happens not as much as the low speed damping, but when it happens to you, it's the point where you're kind of paying attention because something really happened to you.
Yeah.
Especially those super fast shaft speeds, and you want the fork to not behave differently in that case because you're doing something scary. So I don't think it's quite as dependent on rider size. Of course, it makes sense. A bigger guy is going to smash a little harder, but that maybe isn't the driving factor. I think, I'm trying to recall some study, but I think one of our fellows in the office actually won the highest shaft speed contest. Nice. And it's because he'll admittedly say he's not the smoothest rider. He'll crack into something pretty hard, you know? So, and then really a lot of your max shaft speeds events happen off of drops.
Yes.
There's just a lot of energy happening.
So here we got this rod. How does this Charger 3 damper isolate or separate low speed adjustment from high speed adjustment?
That's pretty neat. It might be hard to show, but let's try. So I'm taking apart the top cap off of the IFP chamber. 2 adjusters here, and they operate independently. The center bit with a 2.5 mil moves that tiny receiver there.
Yep.
And then this bit on the outside is spinning the 4 fingers on the outside. And that is hooked to, here's our IFP spring, we call that. But inside here you have mating pieces. Here's the screwdriver that's intended to mate with the low speed adjuster. And then there's a 4-pronged setup there that mates with these 4 prongs. And that's your high speed bit.
And is that, so would the low speed be an orifice damper, basically reducing the size of a port? And then is that preload on the shims for the high speed?
No, this is unique to us. It works in a novel way, maybe you could say. The low speed bit is very similar to, if you've ever experienced anything with damper design, or there's a piston with preloaded shims on it, and through the center you have some sort of needle, and your low speed needle either goes down and closes the path through the center, or if you pull it out, it opens the path through the center. If it's in the closed position, you're forcing all the oil to go through that preloaded shim stack. And so that's a really traditional design, very basic. You would see that type of design in almost any adjustable damper. And it's actually mirrored here in the rebound piston, but it's on the compression piston. So that's not interesting. We did put a lot of work into making sure that was tuned correctly to meet our needs. The part that's unique for us is that our high-speed damper, the 4 prongs on the outside, is an orifice situation, which happens well in advance of everything I just talked about. So you can think of it as a plumbing problem if you have it turned on, or the lack of a plumbing problem. So you either have like a pipe that's plenty big or a pipe that's a little bit too small on the way to the low speed valve that I described.
So normally, like I said, it's more traditionally style damper. You could say that the low speed damping set the threshold for when the high speed started doing the heavy lifting. Do you see what I mean? Like when it's a relatively small amount of oil flow, that orifice isn't restricted, or it's not restricted enough to slow it. But then when you get a big stroke and it moves the full column of oil in one movement, it then diverts to the high speed.
Yeah.
It sounds like this is slightly different though.
Yeah, so in the valve you just described, if you have a high speed valve that's preloading that shim stack, do the mental experiment with me. If you take that spring off, you've unwound your high speed compression setting. Oil comes at that valve, and it wouldn't matter if your low speed valve is closed or open because there's no resistance through the difficult
it's happy
path.
to just do whatever it wants.
Yeah, so you kind of have this marriage between those two adjusters that really is confusing for the end user. So in the opposite case of that is, let's say you had your low speed closed and your high speed open. So you have no preload on that shim stack and all the oil is just making its way through the piston, not through the center of the valve. If you turn on the high speed compression and you clamp that shim stack down, now all of a sudden, not only are you getting high speed resistance, but you're getting low speed resistance because all of a sudden your low speed valve is actually being effective. So it ends up being a mess. So we tried this design to break those two things apart. And like I kind of said before, it's a plumbing problem, which is this actuator here. That is what is driven by your high-speed adjuster. You either are pushing this forward into that orifice
to restrict it,
or you're getting it the heck out of the way. As oil comes this way, it's either going to be blocked by this piece here, this pyramid, or it's going to be plenty big enough for no back pressure at all. So, and all of this happens well before the traditional style valve. And this is just a piston with an easy path and a hard path, and you just turn the low speed in it and force it through the shim stack, or you open the low speed and it gets a free pass. So
simple as that. And just with that sort of clock face on the Charger 3, I think it's got 4 clicks for the high speed.
There should be 5 positions, 4 clicks. Yeah.
And does that relate to?
Well, we did our best.
As much as you can to those steps.
These are little tolerance bands, so that if all the parts come together and you have this little shift, we really tried to make best we can one damper perform the same as another damper. Of course, takes sensitivity to all the tolerances into account. So yeah.
Well, there we go.
That's our attempt.
Cool. So, I'm trying to think, and then the rebound damping, like you said, mirrors roughly, like restricting an orifice similar to like what you'd see on...
Yeah, rebound piston is pretty traditional. You have oil trapped, let's say you're deep in the stroke, and your oil is here, and it needs to come onto this side of the piston. Depending on where you have your adjuster, you could advance it all the way. Forward, righty-tighty, turning off the flow. And that's oil going into this point here, and we just turn that off. So now the oil is forced through a shim stack here, and that's what you're doing when you close your rebound down.
And so, in a certain way, because oil is being forced through a shim, I mean, I suppose what I wanted to ask is, high-performance fork, it's commonplace now for us to have high and low-speed compression damping external adjustments, but also quite commonplace for just have one rebound adjuster. Is that because it's shim damped anyway? You actually maybe negate the need for a separate high-speed adjustment?
Correct. For some of our athletes with specific requests, we have a very limited number of folks. We've allowed some extra tuning here, and that's to drive their specific desire for a rebound setting. What we find is that having 2 knobs down here it requires extra intentionality for the end user. So at this moment, we're happy with what we've given. We've kind of helped guide customers to a good spot rather quickly. And I suppose like a four-way adjustable damper serves a purpose, but it might overserve some folks.
Yes.
In a way.
Overserve. Very pragmatic.
Coin that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I mean, I think that's kind of really most things covered. Hey.
Yeah, there is a secret trick in here. I'm not going to tell you how it works, but it's quiet. I think that's sick.
Quiet in terms of the
damping noise,
or
yeah.
in terms of top out. A bit of both.
Both, but mostly we're talking about noise during the actuation of the damper. There's a lot of thinking that went into that to make Pike, Lyric, Zeb, Boxxer operate smoothly and essentially silently. Just getting the slush noise out of there was a personal goal of mine.
No, not a fan of like the slurpy.
Yeah, I don't like the slurpy sound. And once you get used to it, it's real hard to go away from that. So
Amazing.
That's about it for unless you have something specific.
No,
you'd
no.
like to ask.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your time, and
Sure.
that's super interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, the new Boxxer broken down to pretty much all its constituent parts.